On an average morning, Colonel Philip Shue drove I-10 as part of his daily commute. But April 16, 2003 was not an average morning for Philip Shue. At 8 a.m., witnesses watched as the Colonel's tan Mercury Tracer departed from the highway and drove into the median, weaving between several light poles. His car returned to the road for about a mile more before fellow drivers saw him turn abruptly to the right, crossing a grassy incline and frontage road before crashing into one tree and then spinning into a next. Here, near the exit for Johns Road. But while an accident of this magnitude was certainly out of the ordinary for the Colonel, so much more had already happened that morning. First of all, Colonel Shue had been driving the other direction, away from the city and away from work. Even stranger, paramedics and first responders discovered duct tape around the Colonel's wrists and ankles, as if he had been bound. Colonel Shue had sustained obvious injuries not related to the crash. He was missing part of a pinky finger and both nipples, body parts that were never found. Something was different about this case, a case that will have authorities disagreeing for decades. Something very strange was going on, something strange and unknown, something that resulted in the bizarre death of Colonel Philip Shue. On the morning of April 16, 2003, Philip Shue told his wife Tracy that he was headed to the office early to take care of some paperwork. Philip worked at the Wilford Hall Medical Center at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. He had coffee with Tracy before leaving his home in Boerne, Texas at about 5:30 a.m., an hour earlier than he would have usually left. Where he went next is unknown. The first sheriff's press release regarding this case read, "Mysteries still surround occurrences during the roughly 2-hour, 15-minute period from the time he left home to the time of his fatal accident." And even though more than 20 years has passed since that press release, that statement still holds. Colonel Shue is seen next around 8 a.m. Morning commuters watched in horror as Shue's vehicle traversed 500 yards in the median before returning to the road. He appears to drive normally for a short stretch of time, but the Colonel's car soon turned abruptly right, leaving the pavement near Johns Road and hitting the trees. At 8:14 a.m., EMS personnel, Kendall County Sheriff's deputies, and troopers from the Texas Department of Public Safety were dispatched to the scene. What they found had responders immediately alarmed. In the driver's seat, Colonel Shue had duct tape wrapped around his wrists and ankles. Strips of it dangled several inches from each of the Colonel's wrists, as if his hands had been forcibly restrained, and no roll of duct tape could be found inside the vehicle. The T-shirt under the Colonel's uniform had been ripped, and there was a 6-inch gash across his chest. Above that, his nipples had been cut off. Additionally, the distal joint from his left pinky finger had been removed, and his earlobe had been cut. Neither the pinky or the Colonel's nipples could be located in the car or near the scene. He had $47 in his pocket, but Phil's wallet and dog tags were also missing. They, too, have never been found. But despite their initial alarm and the many various oddities discovered, authorities didn't treat the area or the car as a crime scene. The car was searched, but not preserved. Instead of going to a secure area maintained by law enforcement, it was hauled from the crash site to a local wrecking yard, and potential evidence wasn't saved. Some of it is even given away. Phil's body, as well, is initially taken to a nursing home instead of the medical examiner's office. And the reason for some of these issues seems to be a disagreement about jurisdictions. Many different departments had responded to the accident. Who was in charge at the scene? The Texas Department of Public Safety or the Sheriff's Department? More than 7 hours later, when Colonel Shue's wife Tracy is informed of the car accident, she is not told about the additional injuries or the mutilation. though she is asked by a representative of the Department of Public Safety if there's any reason that the colonel would have had duct tape around his wrists and ankles. Shocked, Tracy's mind goes right to the threatening letters that her husband had received. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, "they've killed him." In the days and weeks leading up to the accident, the colonel and his wife, Lieutenant Colonel Tracy Shue, had been planning to make some major life changes. The day before the crash, the two had signed a contract for a 3,800 square foot home 900 miles away in Birmingham, Alabama. Tracy described the lakefront house as a dream home, one that they both immediately fell in love with. Phil had been accepted into a fellowship at the University of Alabama, something he considered to be a stepping stone into a new career in forensic science. With dreams of his own practice as a forensic psychiatrist, Phil was retiring from the Air Force, but not from his career. His longtime friend, Police Chief George Brown, spoke about Colonel Shue on several occasions, and he said, quote, "He was happy about retirement, happy about relocating, and loved his life." End quote. The only thing Phil had to not be happy about was the threats. For nearly 4 years, Phil had been the recipient of multiple anonymous written warnings and threats on his life. The first letter arrived in May of 1999, 4 years earlier. It had been postmarked from Pensacola, Florida, and read, "Dear Dr. Shue, please read this letter. You may be in danger. I'm writing because I remember you as such a kind and caring doctor, and I can't just sit by and not help you by telling you what I know. I'll try to keep it short so you're certain to read it. A friend of mine who worked with Don, your ex-wife's husband, told me some scary things. I don't know Don or your ex-wife myself. Sorry, I don't even know her name. My friend told me that they wish you were dead so they could collect life insurance. I don't understand why they would have life insurance on you, but that's what my friend told me. My friend thinks they may actually be planning something. I don't know if they would actually hurt you, but please be careful. I had to write. If I didn't, I couldn't bear the thought of something bad happening to you that I could have prevented by telling you what I heard. If I hear anything more specific, I will let you know. Please be careful. I'm sorry to worry you, but I just couldn't not write and find out later that I could have stopped a bad thing from happening." Could that bad thing finally have happened? Had Colonel Shue been murdered in a plot to redeem his life insurance? 54 years old at the time of the crash, Philip Shue had been born and raised in Brookville, Ohio, where he met his first wife, Nancy Young. They married in 1970, and a few months later, Nancy gave birth to their son, who they named Jeffrey. The following year, Phil received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin and enlisted in the Air Force. But not long into his time with the Air Force, Phil experienced several medical emergencies where he lost consciousness suddenly. He was diagnosed with Meniere's disease, a disorder of the inner ear that can cause episodes of vertigo, tinnitus, and hearing loss. The illness made him a liability as a pilot and cost him his flight career. So he pivoted, training to become a physician's assistant. Phil received a medical degree from Wright State University in 1984, next completing his psychiatric residency at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. During this time, his marriage to Nancy became strained. The couple argued about money, and there were allegations of infidelity. When it became too much, the two separated. Phil took a job at Eglin Air Force Base and moved to Florida, where he met Tracy. The two began to see each other as Phil finalized his divorce with Nancy. While Phil and Nancy had been married, Nancy had become the beneficiary on 2 life insurance policies totaling $1 million. As a part of their divorce settlement, Nancy retained the rights to both policies. Over the years, Phil had asked her to cancel them, but she had not. It was 7 years after the divorce, while Philip was working on his master's degree in public health from the University of Texas, that he received his first threatening letter in the mail. Nancy had remarried a man named Colonel Donald Timpson, an active duty pilot with the Air Force Special Forces Unit. The couple was living in Florida, the same state where the letter had been postmarked. Around this time, Phil also began to receive phone calls on his home phone line that Tracy described as strange. The calls stopped when they changed phone numbers to an unlisted one. After that, Phil found another letter stuck under his windshield wipers. This one read, in part, "The plan is now delayed, but not canceled. Be careful. I can't identify myself because they may find out, and stop letting information slip." Phil confronted Nancy, asking her again to cancel the life insurance policies, but Nancy declined and denied discussing Phil's death with her husband. She told Phil that someone may be playing some sort of sick joke on him. Phil himself attempted to cancel the life insurance policies, but both insurance companies, USAA and Northwestern Mutual, refused. Nancy was the policy owner, and Phil had no authority to cancel them. The policies would remain so long as Nancy continued to pay the premiums. Phil responded to the insurance companies with a letter which instructed them to, quote, "thoroughly examine my death for evidence of foul play, even if on the surface the cause would appear natural or accidental," end quote. The Kendall County Sheriff's Department did not have the funds or resources to fly to Florida and interview Nancy or her husband Don, so the Air Force Office of Special Investigations conducted their interviews. The two denied any involvement in Phil's death, and both had solid alibis for the morning of April 16th. They both had been at work hundreds of miles away in Florida. Investigators were quick to label the crash suspicious, though communication with the public and the family was slow. The Kendall County Sheriff's Department's press release did not come until May 21st, 35 days after the crash, and it read in part, "Investigators have noted the duct tape and numerous other clues that indicate the probable presence of foul play in this incident, and an active, ongoing criminal investigation is being conducted. There has been no reasonable explanation for the presence of these tape wrappings other than they were possibly used for bindings." It also says that, quote, "there is considerable evidence that he did come into contact with an unknown persons who placed him under great duress. No one at the Wilford Hall Medical Center saw or can place Colonel Shue at the facility on that morning, and it is believed that he never arrived." The Kendall County Texas Crime Stoppers announced a reward of $5,000 for information, leading to the arrest of anyone involved in Shue's death. And 2 weeks later, the Shue family increased that amount to $50,000. Tracy Shue told Derek Ali from the Dayton Daily News that the sheriff's office had confirmed to her that Phil had been tortured, though Lieutenant Roger Anderson, head of the Kendall County Sheriff's Department's Criminal Investigation Division, declined to comment. Autopsy and toxicology reports had not yet been completed, and he said that it was too soon to make any conclusions without additional information. Once completed, the autopsy results were not released to the public, though officials did share that Colonel Shue's cause of death was determined to be due to head injuries suffered from the car accident. It seemed to Phil's family and to the public that Phil had somehow been abducted on his way to work and then crashed during his escape. But who abducted the colonel? Tracy told reporters that Phil had, quote, "no difficult patients and no reason to really suspect any patient. He was just winding down from the military and kind of focusing on his next life," she said. As the weeks passed, Phil's family grew frustrated with the lack of progress. Tracy complained about the lack of coordination and cooperation between the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and the Sheriff's Department, saying, "I think the Texas Rangers need to get involved." But Air Force OSI spokesman Mike Richmond was dismissive of her complaint, saying, "We've done what they've asked us to do." The idea that Phil may have planned a false abduction and committed suicide was incomprehensible to his lifelong friends and family. "He was stable," said Police Chief George Brown. "My theory is that he was injected with some substance and was disoriented enough that he couldn't make normal, rational decisions," end quote. Yet, at the end of July, the medical examiner ruled Colonel Shue's death a suicide. Bexar County Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Vincent DeMaio concluded that the wounds on Philip's body had been self-inflicted and that he had deliberately driven off the highway and into the trees. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations agreed. 2 witnesses following behind Colonel Shue's car before the accident told investigators that Phil had not used his brakes before veering off the road, and there had been no skid marks located on the highway. The autopsy had revealed no defensive wounds on Colonel Shue's hands, and several scratches near the gash in his chest were considered to be hesitation marks, places where a knife had been pressed while working up the will to inflict an injury. Additionally, the autopsy found what was described as a high concentration of an anesthetic in his blood. Stunned, Tracy Shue insisted that Phil was the victim of foul play. He couldn't possibly have mutilated himself, slicing off his nipples, a finger, or making the 6-inch gaping gash to his chest. Phil had, she admitted, self-prescribed himself a mild anesthetic cream to treat itchy and irritated skin, something that he had suffered from after shaving parts of his chest for a stress test 10 days earlier. Dr. DeMaio thought that Colonel Shue may have used the cream to deaden the pain of self-mutilation. Dr. DeMaio was a highly regarded authority in his field and was considered an expert on gunshot wounds. He had authored several textbooks and has testified as an expert witness in numerous high-profile cases, including the assassination of John F. Kennedy, George Zimmerman, and the West Memphis Three. Dr. DeMaio pointed out that Colonel Shue had made no attempts to call for help with his phone, which had been found inside the vehicle. He had passed several exits while on the highway and not taken any of them. Additionally, it was later determined that he had passed a Bernie police officer stopped along the interstate and had not attempted to get their attention or assistance in any way. Phil's friends and family were in disbelief, and many spoke up in his defense, like Police Chief George Brown and longtime friend Tony Schaefer, who said, quote, "I'm 100% certain it's not a self-inflicted situation. I would stake my life on that. Phil was just too much into enjoying life and looking forward to life." Tracy was frustrated. She believed that the crime scene had been compromised. Phil's cell phone had been given to one of his neighbors, who had returned it to her. The neighbor told Tracy that there had been blood on the inside of the flip phone, as if he had attempted to use it. If the fact that he didn't use the cell phone to call for help was part of Bexar County's argument for suicide, why hadn't the phone been taken into evidence? The sheriff's department wouldn't rule out foul play in Colonel Shue's case, but their attempts to track Phil's location in the several hours before his accident had failed. A grand jury was convened and, after careful consideration, found no evidence of a crime. Still, Tracy quickly filed a civil lawsuit against Nancy and her son Jeffrey in order to prevent them from collecting on Phil's life insurance. Just 5 days before his death, Phil had removed Jeffrey from his will and replaced him with Tracy's sister. According to Tracy, Phil had concerns about Jeffrey's poor money management skills. He had gone through a bankruptcy and had struggled with a gambling addiction. Phil's cousin Ron additionally thought that Jeffrey may not have been Phil's biological son. Tracy also filed claims against the 2 insurance companies that had carried the life insurance policies that Nancy owned on Phil. Texas law allowed for life insurance policies to be canceled in instances of fraud, and Tracy's attorney contended that murder in order to collect on life insurance would constitute fraud. Tracy Shue hired famed forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril H. Wecht to perform a second autopsy of Colonel Shue's body. Dr. Wecht was also a lawyer who had served several years in the U.S. Air Force. He, too, was a highly sought-after expert witness for many famous cases. He had been chosen by the American Academy of Forensic Sciences to critique the Warren Report, and it was Dr. Wecht who had revealed that several important specimens, including JFK's brain, had disappeared. The 2 famous forensic scientists had vastly differing opinions on Philip's case. Dr. DeMaio strongly believed that Phil had committed suicide, but after his own autopsy and review of the facts, Dr. Wecht believed that someone else had been involved that morning. he theorized that perhaps Phil had been abducted, tortured, and then died in the crash after his escape. Dr. Wecht pointed to the fact that Colonel Shue's fingerprints were not found on the duct tape, and no gloves had been found in the car. Several small pocket knives had been in the vehicle, but none of them had been used to inflict the injuries sustained by the colonel. When testing showed that one of the ingredients in Dr. Shue's self-prescribed itch cream had not been found in his blood, Dr. DeMaio amended his theory on the source of the lidocaine. Dr. DeMaio decided that Phil must have injected himself with the numbing agent, and with no injection marks located on the body, this had probably been done through his missing nipples. A year following the crash, in the spring of 2004, the FBI stepped in to review the toxicology findings. According to Tracy, the stress from receiving death threats had prompted Phil to seek the assistance of a psychiatrist, and at the time of his death, he had been prescribed both Klonopin and Effexor to manage his anxiety. Texas investigators had found evidence of neither drug during their testing, but the FBI determined that there were trace amounts of Klonopin in the colonel's blood. However, they found no evidence of the Effexor. Effexor is expected to remain in a person's bloodstream for about a week after they stop taking it, and it does have some nasty withdrawal side effects, including nausea, dizziness, and painful headaches. While Phil's coworkers and Tracy all reported that Phil was behaving normally in the days before his death, there has been some public speculation that Effexor withdrawal could have caused Phil's erratic behavior that morning. These blood test results were all released in the Psychological Autopsy Report, which is a 20-page document published 2 years after the accident by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. The document argued that Colonel Shue's death was a suicide and laid out the reasons for determining so. 2 board-certified forensic psychiatrists contributed, Lieutenant Commander Gerald Donovan and Colonel Elspeth Cameron Ritchie. They wrote that Colonel Shue's mental state had made him depressed, anxious, and paranoid. Colonel Shue had been seeing staff psychiatrist Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Dion for several months prior to his death. Apparently, he had told Colonel Dion that he had experienced a disturbing dissociative episode in which he imagined losing control of his car on the way to work. Though I should note that there is some controversy regarding this story, and while it does appear in the Psychological Autopsy Report, Lieutenant Colonel Dion later says that he does not recall hearing about this imagined crash and that there was no documentation of it in any of his own notes. The report also states that Lieutenant Colonel Dion believed that Colonel Shue was responding well to treatment and did not appear to be suicidal, which was common of the people that were interviewed about Philip Shue. None of the people that knew him thought that he would harm himself. In the summer of 2008, Tracy's civil suit went to trial. In the 5 years since she'd first filed the suit, Nancy, Jeffrey, and Northwestern Mutual had been dropped as defendants. They had come to a separate settlement agreement. As part of the lawsuit, defendants had sat for videotaped depositions, and during this deposition, Nancy is asked a number of questions about her ex-husband, Phil, and her potential involvement in his death. But on the advice of legal counsel, Nancy pleads the Fifth Amendment in order to avoid self-incrimination more than 20 times, which of course fuels suspicion and speculation. USAA remained the sole defendant in Tracy's lawsuit, and after looking at the evidence, Judge Bill Palmer ruled that they had done nothing wrong by refusing to cancel the colonel's insurance policy. USAA was not responsible for what had happened to Colonel Shue and was not liable for any damages. But then, Judge Palmer announced something else. As a conclusion to his ruling in Tracy Shue's civil lawsuit, Judge Bill Palmer stated that Colonel Shue had been murdered and ruled his death a homicide. Judge Palmer requested that Phil's death certificate be changed, but the Kendall County officials refused. When the Texas Attorney General reviewed the case, they ruled that the death certificate need not be altered. And so it still says suicide to this day. The following year, 48 Hours aired an episode covering the colonel's suspicious death. They interviewed Lieutenant Roger Anderson of the Kendall County Sheriff's Office, who had been at the crash scene that morning. He called the investigation, quote, severely hampered. Lieutenant Anderson acknowledged the jurisdictional issues at the scene between the numerous agencies there, and he stated that because the death was not initially considered to be a homicide, that the car was never processed as a murder scene, admitting that evidence may have been lost or overlooked. Lieutenant Anderson expressed a significant amount of guilt over this and said that he now believes that Colonel Shue may have been intercepted on his way to work and tortured, though he acknowledges that he cannot prove this theory. CBS producers hired their own private investigator, Joe Mora, who looked at the available evidence and stated, quote, there was no investigation. Host Troy Roberts speaks with Tracy about her relationship with Phil, and they have this notable exchange.
Injuries that he sustained are consistent with an act of sadism, and they certainly are sexual in nature.
Forgive me, but I have to ask this question. Did your husband have an interest in this fetish himself?
No, he did not. And it's interesting that you would ask that question because you are actually the first person out of the entire 5-year time frame that has ever asked me that question. And I do believe it is an appropriate question to ask.
After the episode aired, an eyewitness came forward to say that they believed that they had seen Colonel Shue's car parked along a road with a blue van parked behind it. This happened to be a road along the colonel's typical route to work, so it seemed to be a very promising lead. But after so many years, could this person really have remembered the location and the vehicles accurately? If it was a reliable tip, then it makes you wonder what happened to that blue van. If somehow Colonel Shue had been abducted from the side of the road by someone in a blue van, how had he gotten back to his car? There are so many questions in this case and so few answers. Could Phil have staged his own abduction and then died accidentally? Where are his dog tags, his wallet, his finger? Despite the repeated appearance of suspicious behavior, Nancy and Dawn have never been named as suspects in Phil's death, which remains listed as a suicide officially. And I think that's unlikely to change because officials are no longer investigating Philip Shue's death, bizarre as it is. Perhaps someday there will be more evidence, another witness or a confession. Maybe his wallet will be recovered. Or maybe there's still digital forensics that could reveal a motive or more about the colonel's state of mind. Until that day, I think this case will remain uncertain and suspicious. The bizarre and unfortunate death of Colonel Philip Shue.